Hi guys. So sorry. Um, One last video, but it's not an essential video, but it always does kind of tie things together. Probably a good review material, piece of review material. But we have 5.10 that really ties the whole chapter together. Sorry. And it's continuity and change in the industrial age. And in general, it's pretty easy to argue that it changed way more than stay the same. They're going to really focus a lot on these changes, but some stuff did stay continuous, and we'll look at that too. So it divides it on subject themes. So it first starts with economic continuities and changes. Right? So the big change would be that Europe becomes the economic center of the world and then becomes kind of like the force with which shapes economics across the planet. So Europe becomes industrialized there. And then other regions that are industrializing that also had kind of been in the economic periphery, like Japan and Russia and the United States or North America, by the end of the 20th century, have begun to also produce and, in fact, the economy to the same scale that Western Europe is. Now, the statement the rest of the world became less productive, it's not like they made less in some cases. Some cases when Europe conquered them and added them to their empires, they changed what they're producing. A lot of them transitioned into producing raw materials that had not been the case before. So that is like they're making less of certain things, but also proportionally they're making less because they're not industrial economies, right? So even if their economies stay the same, they're making less proportionally to the rest of the world. Where raw materials are coming from, the colonies become far more like clearly defined places where raw materials come from. And then steam power enables distant colonies to be more instrumental to the economies of European metropoles or European home countries, because you can get someplace a lot quicker. You can get someplace a lot quicker because you have steam power. You don't have to rely on wind power anymore and stuff like that. In Western Europe, there is a pretty large economic change in that mercantilism, which was this very constricted economic system that the state controlled a lot of what and how things were traded. That system pretty much collapses throughout Europe, and free trade, laissez-faire economics becomes a far more significant policy during this period. And life quality decreases for many people as a consequence of like industrialization and things like that, and what kind of labor is being done in Europe also changes. Socially, physical labor is a thing that people is still like the largest kind of labor, right? You have like, what do you call it? Not physical, but like mental labor and emotional labor, and then physical labor. Physical labor remains one of the most important or the most consistently or prevalent kind of labor. But what kind of physical labor changes a great deal, right? Factory work is different than agricultural work. So like that is a continuity in that is physical labor. It's a change in the kind of labor. Office labor is a pretty new thing where like people can like sit and work at the same time. What? That's like a new thing. And then because these organizations become so big, these businesses become so big, they need to actually invest resources in just people whose job it is to keep track of who's doing what job, right? That's like a new thing. Who is wealthy and what defined wealth changes as well. Historically, land is still an adequate predictor of wealth, right? So if you own a lot of land, you are likely wealthy, but you don't just need to own land to become wealthy, right? Like a factory owner who owns 4 factories might not own that much physical land, but what they're producing is way more resources than maybe somebody who owns, many, many square miles of farmland, right? So land ownership still is a predictor of wealth, but no longer is the sole predictor of wealth. For gender industrialization, women in the working class continue to work. Like that is not a deviation. Women are still doing that kind of work. However, women not working becomes a status symbol, and like the call to domesticity and all that stuff that we talked about in the 5.9 video. That is a change. That is a change. Politically, something that I really have a bone to pick with AMSCO is their failure to discuss the revolutions of 1848, which when we're talking about Europe becoming this very more important like continent in the world, The revolutions of 1848 dramatically changed the trajectory of European politics. In the end, the revolutions of 1848 put most of Western Europe and Central Europe on the path towards democracy, but so that by the early 20th century, many of these states are democratic in nature, and so that's like really significant. And essentially, the Revolution of 1848. There's the Irish potato famine you learned about. That famine, that blight that affected potatoes all across Europe. Europeans liked potatoes because they grew up in the very, very inhospitable climate of most of Europe, right? Like the heavy winters that Europe has, specifically away from the Mediterranean coast. Potatoes are really important for that food system. And so the food system collapses. There are already all these other discontents from like industrialization and things like that. And so this ignites revolutions across Europe in 1848. And the consequences, most states begin a process of, what do you call it? My brain. Of democratization afterwards. So also in that same process, that democratization eventually leads to selective male suffrage, universal male suffrage, and by the middle of the 20th century, universal suffrage, including women. Also, because the middle class begins to expand, a unlanded but influential class that like can donate to political campaigns or have distinct interests and can leverage those interests in a democratic system become important to appease. And so political leaders adapt policies to appease the middle class. And that's a change, right? Because remember, we are leaving a several hundred, if not 1,000-year tradition of humanity in which people had very limited means with which to hold their governments accountable because most governments weren't democratic, right? And democracy gives most people more means to hold their political leaders accountable that a despotic or absolutist monarchy wouldn't have. And then, because labor gets so crappy during industrialization, people feel compelled to change that, and these democratic processes also play a role in that. And that's the rest of the video, just as announcements are coming on. So, quick little video, and you'll see me, guys. See y'all. I'll see y'all in the next video or in my class. Bye, guys.